All right, we are now live.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brenda Gunn. I am the Academic and Research Director at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. I am so pleased today to host our Lunch and Learn, which is on unconscious bias and debunking stereotypes. We have two amazing speakers joining us here today. We have Dr. Cary Miller and Jessie Wente joining us. I'm going to ask the panels to introduce themselves in just a minute. But first, I just want to share that our goal of the Lunch and Learn sessions is to help people move through a process of learning the truth of the history and legacy of residential schools, understanding and unlearning some of the things that people may have learned about Indigenous peoples, and throughout the course of the week, getting us to a point of reconciliation. For those of you who may not know, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation is an organization based in Winnipeg, hosted by the University of Manitoba. We continue the work started by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We host an archive of 5 million records, including all of the survivor statements that were taken by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We continue to acquire new records. We undertake research to continue understanding the history and legacy of residential schools, as well as engage in public education. So with all of that, I am going to turn it to I have two other housekeeping items to say. We will be using the question and answer function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. As we are in a Zoom webinar and not a normal Zoom meeting, attendees today will not be able to see one another and you will not be able to chat with one another, but you can ask questions to the panelists by typing in the question and answer or Q&A at the bottom of the screen. We have French simultaneous interpretation, and you can use the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen. We also have ASL interpretation, which should be pinned on the screen for you. There are health supports available. There is the National Indian Residential School Crisis Line, as well as the Hope for Wellness line that is available to people if they need resources. And we will share that in the chat for people today. Okay, now I think I'm really done all my housekeeping matters, and now I'm really going to turn to Cary Miller to introduce herself, and then to Jessie to introduce himself. Thank you.
Bonjour, Kechekwa Indigenous Makwandodem, Ojibwe Anishinaabe and Dao. I'm a 60s scoop survivor. My birth families are from St. Croix in Wisconsin and Leech Lake in Minnesota. I'm privileged to now live on Treaty 1 territory and serve at the University of Manitoba as the Associate Vice President Indigenous for Research and Curriculum. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this important panel.
Thank you. Jessie.
Ani bonjour. My name is Jessie Wente. I'm Anishinaabe from Toronto. My family comes from Chicago and Ganabajing Anishinaabe in the North Shore of Lake Huron. The government calls it the Serpent River First Nation. I am Ojibwe Bear Clan, and I am really, and in terms of professionally, I'm chair of the Canada Council for the Arts and a writer and a speaker, and I'm really delighted to be here.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us today. I know we're going to have an amazing conversation. You know, where do we begin in today's topic, right, of unconscious bias and debunking stereotypes? And I don't know, do we start at the beginning? Where does the beginning start? Can we start with the idea of what is the relationship between stereotypes and colonialism. I mean, let's just dive right in. Does that work? Cary, do you want to start off, and then Jesse, you can jump in?
Yeah, this is something I've thought a lot about. And I think that, when we recognize that the histories that have been taught have been very one-sided and have presented Indigenous people in particular ways that have helped the colonial project, it helps us to move forward in our learning in a different way. In general, you can have racism without colonialism, but you can't have colonialism without racism. Colonialism essentially is an ideology that explains why one community has more right to resources than another community who was already using them. So what are some of the inherent myths that not only are in our textbooks, but are in what we might say is the canonical literature supporting them? It's the myth of the wilderness. Indigenous people lived all across North America in very large numbers. There is no national park anywhere in North America that was created without removing Indigenous people. So realizing that, this idea of a pristine, untouched wilderness that not only comes out of, these sort of national park systems, but also out of authors like Thoreau that are, very strongly embraced in literature departments. This is something that gets embedded across multiple sectors of society. The myth that Indigenous people didn't engage in agriculture, which I find to be a much more embedded myth in Canada than in the United States. We practiced agriculture. We practiced, rather than single crop agriculture and rotation, the way that we see farmers today, we practiced polyculture, where you had multiple plants planted in the same field, corn and beans together, so that they could engage in the nitrogen exchange, as well as squash to help keep moisture in the ground with those huge leaves. So in addition to that, wild ricing, in addition to that, managing the landscape to encourage the populations on which we relied. So controlled burns, not only to support the abundance of blueberries, but also to support the spaces in which deer would browse. The early descriptions of North America talk about old growth forests with enormous trees and spaces between them as wide as you could drive a carriage through. And so when we look at the original range of the bison and we see them identified as being in the woodlands, this is precisely because the land was managed, those forests were managed in a way that the bison could come in, which is not the way that our forests really are managed now. So low population, randomly moving hunters, wilderness, all of that combines into an idea that it is okay to move Indigenous populations, whether that's to reservations or to residential schools. So I'll start with just those. There are, of course, many, many more, but I want to give Jesse a chance to come in and jump in on this.
Yeah,
Well,
and I love this idea of myth, right? I use the word stereotype in calling them myths. Sorry, Jesse, you were going to say, go ahead.
no, I agree. And I agree with everything that Cary said. And I think maybe what I would add is how those myths then become unconscious bias or sort of self-held is that colonial states, those myths are created often even in advance of the arrival of settlers. So like one can look at things like the doctrine of discovery as myth storytelling, and like the whole notion before colonialism even occurs, there's already this advanced sort of storytelling. And then once these countries sort of begin to establish themselves and reach some maturity and begin to form, like, say, constitutions, they then begin to actually embed these myths in policy and in their institutions. So like all the things that Cary mentioned, if you think of when Canada's formed from like 1867, say through to, well, let's say through to when First Nations people get the vote in 1960. So like a little less than 100 or so years, right? But in that time, when we weren't part of Canadian democracy and we were being, all sorts of horrible stuff was happening to us, the whole storytelling infrastructure of Canada is established. All the museums, all the major galleries, the Canada Council for the Arts, which is the result of the Massey Commission, which is a incredibly colonial sort of project, the National Film Board, the CBC, all of this infrastructure that then sort of propagates those myths, somewhat even by then unconsciously. It's just the colonial approach means that they just do this. And so that by the time we reach 2023, it's been generations that people have been told these stories over and over again that aren't just stories of falsity, they're also stories of absence, right? Where, as Cary mentioned, Indigenous people just aren't part of them. If you think of so many of the most famous landscape paintings of Canada, it's just the land. And I understand the land is beautiful. You don't have to tell a First Nations person how beautiful the land is. We know, we literally worship it. But the point is, we're not there. And it's part of that sort of the same idea of just this human absence on these lands, which allowed colonialism. So then you have all these institutions that sort of foster these myths in America because it's so capitalist. Like you just have Hollywood, and that sort of infrastructure sort of naturally defends colonialism, like the Western, which is really the only film genre invented in America, is entirely embedded with the myth, the creation myth of America. And likewise, in Canada, where we don't have as big a market, we've state-funded the production of these myths. So I'll just do a quick example and then we can stop. When the Canada Council for the Arts was founded, of the organization I am now the chair of, when it was founded in 1957, Indigenous people were ineligible for a Canada Council for the Arts grant in any Indigenous art form, because Indigenous art forms were not considered art. They were considered primitive or craft. It was not art. So if you wanted to be an Indigenous person and get a grant from the Canada Council for the Arts, you had to be performing a European art form. Now, this is colonialism. It is in the same toolbox as residential schools. It's not quite as violent as residential schools, but it is the same idea. It has the same goal in mind, which is to stop us from being us. So in furtherance of the colonial goal, which is none of us, so that we can just take full control of the land. I think it is a measure of progress that an Indigenous person is now the chair of the Canada Council for the Arts. We have our own funding there. This shows some of the promise of these places if we can actually organize and do the work, and of years of advocacy by our communities of what can actually occur. But my point is, these institutions are sort of embedded myth-making machines, myth-propagating machines. And I also want to say to the audience, this is why you don't know these things. It's not because you're not smart or that you can't clue in. You weren't told them, and you weren't told them on purpose. And it doesn't mean that the politicians living today are the ones that decided, but people did decide at one point, and people have decided to continue that legacy up until very, very recently. So I would say that's sort of how those myths become unconscious bias that we now all have to overcome by doing the truth part of truth and reconciliation.
100%, 100%. And being from Chicago, you're probably familiar with the history of the Chicago World's Fair, where in the late 19th century, they actually had on display peoples from around the world along an avenue leading up to, quote unquote, the White City, where the Field Museum is now, and arrayed in such a way that they believed was this developmental progress. So when we think about these myths, one of these is this idea of hierarchies of different types of civilizations. It's one of the reasons that people keep thinking of us as hunter-gatherers rather than agrarian. It puts us at a particular place on that ladder in that perspective. And not only that, it underpins this whole mythology that the line of progress leads to European culture, which, I think that's raised in what you're talking about with the arts, but it's also there, all across all of our different academic disciplines. It shows up in maps. You see all of these historical maps that only show European claims in North America, long before treaties were in play or any kind of cessions could be identified. Periods in which Indigenous people were so powerful, they were being asked to support European conflicts. So, all of these myths have become the background noise, the background fabric that becomes unconscious bias in a really problematic way. I'm sorry, Jess, come on in.
I was just going to say, I don't think there's any greater myth than white supremacy, which is sort of the underpinning of so much of this stuff. That might be the greatest myth. And I think in terms of what we understand or how we think of history, so I was just at a museum. I won't give its name because the museum, they're doing their darndest. So I don't want to say anything disparaging. But I did find it interesting that history, that they had a depiction of sort of chronicling of some elements of human history. And of course, it's entirely based on European people. There's no sense that there was other things happening 1,000 years ago when there so was. And part of the tragedy that we have to overcome is that parts of that has been lost, again, on purpose, I would say. And that loss is actually, I think, deeply felt in these moments when we're facing so many challenging issues as a global human species, that some of that knowledge of how to exist on these lands in relative right relations for 10,000 years is not on these graphs of human history. And I think we always have to consider that when an Anishinaabe person like myself says, I'm on the lands my people have occupied for 13,000 years, that should strike people that we really don't know so much about so much of that time I just listed. And we know so much about a really compacted, short amount of time. And if we're truly knowledge seekers, then we should be much more curious about those things, those big gaps that aren't in the museums. And we can certainly, I think we all intrinsically know why they're not. But I think it hurt me to see that, just because it's like, wow, there's these huge gaps, and I would love for some of our ability to fill those so that we might have a fuller picture of what it is. Because again, when we're considering making decisions that will affect all of humanity, it would be great if we actually consider all of human history and all of those different opinions, not just this very narrow window. And that's also, I think that is when we're, just to bring us back to truth and reconciliation, when we think about the end game, because I don't think actually reconciliation is the end. I think it's a point on a much longer journey. The journey is to get back to understanding all of that and reconnecting with the fact that we've been stuck in a very narrow window of understanding, all of us, quite frankly, not just, and we need to really have a much fuller view. And for some of us, that might be easier because, that fuller view cooked us breakfast, is maybe how I would put it. Do you know what I mean? It's just like the understanding of residential schools. So many Canadians didn't learn it in schools. In every school that I went to, you were not taught these things. You were taught quite the opposite, in fact. And yet, when I think of my classmates, you know, they didn't get the education in it that I did because it cooked me breakfast. I didn't need to go to school for it. It was making me eggs. That whole history was in my kitchen. And now I think some Canadians feel that gap. And so we're trying to catch up because Cary and I, and you, Brenda, and so many of us, we have a lot of experience in reconciliation. That's sort of a daily thing. But now Canadians want to get in on the action. And so we're trying to guide. That was a long answer, but I hope I got some good stuff in there.
No, this is great. And I'm going to interject because I know you guys, like, you don't need me. This is an amazing conversation. But I know in hindsight of 20 minutes, I'm realizing we really did jump into the deep end, and this has been amazing. And I'm wondering, given, you know, our audience, I wonder if we should maybe actually dabble a little toe in the shallow end before we go back to the deep end. And I'm wondering if each of you could, you know, describe a stereotype that exists. And I think, Cary, you started, and then we kind of went in, and maybe we should just, you know, we've sort of set a very big context for people. Let's get a little very tangible, and then we'll go back, I think, to the deep end and some of these big questions that we're talking around.
Well, let me actually give one that is related to Jesse's discussion of museums. And I think this is how, you know, when we talk about this case that I'm going to bring up, look at the erasure, look at the sort of narrative assumptions. So I've been to so many cities where I go to the museum and there's always a gallery about the origin of that city. And the origin of that city always starts with the first European or African, honestly, to found that city, someone who is not from here. And usually they're defined as a fur trader. And we're ignoring a number of things. We're ignoring that, first of all, Indigenous people had huge trade networks that crisscrossed the continent, that used all of our waterways and lakes as superhighways. And so we had major trade centers that had large Indigenous populations. Sault Ste. Marie had a year-round Indigenous population of 800 to 1,000 people, because the rapids, before we put in the locks, were the water moved so swiftly through there that it didn't freeze over, and you could really access the fish year-round. So when we think about seeing these statements of Joe Blow fur trader was the first one to found, Chicago, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Montreal, Ottawa, all of these different places. Is it a good business model if you are an entrepreneur to move into the middle of nowhere, a quote unquote empty place, a quote unquote terra nullius, which we sometimes hear used, and just open up a shop and hope that someone shows up? That seems like an enormous waste of resources, and any businessman would tell you that's a horrible idea. No, you go to where there is a center of population to open up your business. And so in these origin stories of place, we're already erasing the very large concentration of Indigenous people that lived there to begin with. And, in time to that, as we build those cities, we erase all of the archaeological evidence of those settlements, precisely because much of the early history of those cities is during periods when preserving that legacy wasn't valued. So we make assumptions that go into these narratives that then we start passing on without even knowing we're passing it on. And that's unconscious bias. It is, as Jesse noted, part of a decision that is made at one point. But how do we interrupt the transmission of those myths, right, moving forward? And I think that's an important thing for everyone in the audience to consider.
Thank you. Jesse, do you have one you want to share for our audience?
Well, I'll give, what we can do, I could do so many, but I'll do two. One I really like and one I sort of like. So the first one is that we don't pay any tax. And so to answer that, I'm going to give you the name of my accountant. And you can just talk to him and he will tell you that that is just not true. We do pay tax, all sorts of tax, a lot of the same tax you pay. The tax that we don't, some of us, not all of us, by the way, some of us don't pay is a treaty right that we were given. That's it. So yeah, we pay tax, folks. That's not a real thing. Likewise, Canada doesn't give us any money. In fact, if you think of the community that is most supported financially Canada, it is us. We have absolutely given way more resources and money to Canada than we have ever received in back. Then I want to do the one that I sort of like, and this one comes from movies. And if you've ever seen like a Poltergeist or anything, you know that you should never build a subdivision on an Indian burial ground. And that one is true, folks. Don't build. And here's the real kicker. It's all an Indian burial ground. So tough one.
I love it. This is quite the spectrum of myths and stereotypes, but I really appreciate how we've brought these together, because there's hopefully what our audience is starting to see, that myths and stereotypes are created and perpetuated in Canada to first erase Indigenous peoples from the landscape, and then to create stories about who we are to justify removing us from the landscape and to justify what the government is doing, right? So this idea of we aren't here, oh wait, you're still here? Well, you're actually just a drain on Canada, so you shouldn't be here. So we shouldn't recognize you, right? So this is that sort of perpetuation. And the time is very quickly ticking away. I see both of you chomping at the bit to keep the conversation going, but I want us to also very quickly start thinking about, so what do we do? How do we move forward? And this sort of fear, right? We kind of, I think in our pre-conversation, we were talking about this as the Matrix, right? Like, this is the world we know. What do we, like, tearing it down? Is that scary? What happens in the unknown? Are we more, many of us might be more comfortable just staying in the known world, even though maybe it's not a good world or a world based on fiction. It's the world we know. So I want us to start getting to that place, but I'm going to let you both chime in and respond to my comment there.
Sure. So, this is why truth is part of reconciliation, right? We have to learn what we don't know. When I do trainings with faculty, they often end up coming out saying, I didn't know how much I didn't know. And that's half the problem, right? So I think a big piece of it is commitment to learning the truth. And I want to give you, I've been giving you a lot of these deep historical examples, but I want to pull us into the present. So we talked about how Indigenous people were deeply agricultural. Then we got government programs that said, Indigenous people, we're going to turn you into farmers, meaning we're going to turn you into European style single crop rotation farmers. Okay, so we have, for example, the community of Peguis here in Manitoba that was near Selkirk that became incredibly successful at that form of agriculture, to the point that then the immigrants complained, we can't compete with the Indian farmers, it's not fair. And so then they got removed to a flood delta our land that was very difficult to engage in that kind of activity on. And laws were passed that Indigenous people could only sell their farm produce to one another so that they couldn't engage in the wider economy and succeed as farmer entrepreneurs. So there is this process of, even when you open the door, or say, well, if you just do this, as soon as there's success, the door is shut again. And one of the things that we talk about today is a deficit ideology. And this is where a community gets blamed for all of the ills or failings that another society perceives them to have, rather than looking at the causes, rather than looking at these deficiencies as outcomes of the policies and practices and myths themselves. So, I think we have to understand that there's a through line that goes all the way across these early myths and carries them forward into the problematic stereotypes that we have today. There's hunger for a very particular reason. There's economic concerns because of very particular policy and historical reasons. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jesse.
Yeah, I would say ditto to all of that. And then I would add, obviously, I think storytelling is a huge part of this, because I think storytelling is a big part of why we're here. That's a big thing of what we've been discussing. So I think in part of the truth part of it is just engaging with Indigenous artists and storytellers and all across the spectrum and all sorts of different media and mediums, just to try to start to understand and try to gain it. To realize that the truth part of Truth and Reconciliation is likely to take years, if not a generation or more, just because there's still a lot that needs to come, and that there's two parts of truth. There's the telling of it, and then there's the acceptance of it. And I'm not sure we're really at the acceptance part yet. And I'm not sure we're done with the telling. So, and to recognize that part of this process is akin to the grieving process for many people. And so it's also okay for Canadians to be sad about this and to feel bad, like you will. We understand, like, this would be upsetting to learn these things. It was upsetting to know them as a little kid, believe me. So we understand. I think the key is that we then move to action. And then, and obviously I speak from a place where this has been part of my work, but I think it's important that in this time we do look at getting that Indigenous people look to take leadership positions, even within colonial systems, which is really, really hard. I'm not saying it isn't hard. It's incredibly hard, but it is valuable, because we need our community on the outside pushing and on the inside pushing, so that somewhere we can meet in the middle, and that we can work with our understanding of time and how things operate. We can move these systems to a better place. And that one of the things folks who want to see that happen is, when we get into those institutions and into those space, support us, listen to us, and trust that even when we actually suggest radical change, which I must admit I've been known to do in some of these spaces, that's actually, it's okay. That's part of the journey, is that some of these things will actually have to radically change. And yes, it'll be uncomfortable, but we'll actually end up in a way more comfortable spot together, as opposed to this thing where some are really comfortable and some are not so much. So I would say that would be the other big part of it. And to not expect, I think we demand political and cultural resolution to these sorts of issues far too quickly. We are on a journey, folks. It took us 150 years to get to here. it might be foolish to think it won't take exactly that long to get out of here. We just may want to move more dramatically and more aggressively, I guess, is maybe not aggressive. I don't like aggressive as a, but more dramatically or more enthusiastically on certain things to resolve larger issues, because the one of the larger reconciliations that all of humanity faces is with the land. And we probably need to do that one while we're sort of figuring out ourselves as a species and how we relate to one another and figuring out all our old past histories and how we overcome that. We might also need to, at the same time, start figuring out how we live in right relations with the land again. And I think one of the benefits is as we reconcile with each other, that will become easier. And some of the knowledge that will come out of how we actually build systems of right relations instead of systems of, dominance.
Yeah, and I want to build on something that you just said. It is about going through a process of grief, because honestly, the way that we teach history in K-12 is part of building an identity as a Canadian citizen. And so in many ways, when we learn the truth, we go into mourning for that identity that is no longer. And the intent is not to cause you to remain in a place of anger or despair or whatever. It is to recognize that this is an uncomfortable process, but moving through it to acceptance and to engaging in real change is so incredibly rewarding, is so incredibly inspiring. And I feel very privileged to work at the University of Manitoba, where we have made the kind of space that you're talking about for Indigenous people to join decision-making tables in our president's executive team with my boss, the Vice President Indigenous, Catherine Cook, but also looking to bring Indigenous leads into the dean's offices and bringing those voices throughout our campus. We have 5 seats on our faculty senate that are Indigenous seats. So that's the big piece of it, is remembering to bring those voices in. Once you bring them in, don't treat being told something radical, as you mentioned, as, well, this is an outlier. We just have to find a different person. Because no, that's not the solution. The solution is to take what they say seriously and to move forward. And I think that's one of the reasons that the approach has worked here, because we haven't made it just one lone person. We've created a whole office in support of the vice president. We have 5 seats on Senate, so that the voices, as we share them, are collective voices. But even if you only have one Indigenous person in your organization, listen to them, and don't treat them as, the crazy person in the corner. They're telling you truths you need to hear.
Thank you both so much. There are so many amazing questions and comments that are being placed in the Q&A function. I'm trying to moderate, and I'm going to start picking out some of them, but I do want to just, where did I put this on? They said, not a question, but Cary and Jesse, if you were to create your own version of Mythbusters as a TV show or podcast, I would definitely watch and listen to them. And I wanted to share that, throwing it out there, because I also think this is an amazing conversation. One of the things we did talk about in when we were sort of, what are we going to talk about today meeting, was the sort of land back, and it did come into the questions, and someone said, can you touch on land back and what does it really mean? I hear misconceptions around this topic, right? And I think it goes to that fear that Canadians have, and that is also certain segments really intentionally perpetuating and capitalizing on that fear. So do we want to touch on land back as sort of, again, a demonstration of how all of this works? Anyone? Eeny, meeny, miny, mo.
Well,
I sure.
go ahead.
Sure. I'm often asked about this, and I tend to, if I can indulge, I'll tell you a very quick story to illuminate it. So when I was 10 years old, I got it for my birthday. I got a brand new BMX bike. This is a true story, by the way. You can ask my dad. So I got a brand new BMX bike, which this would have been 1984. So if you know anything about human history, you know that getting a BMX bike in 1984 was the greatest single thing to have happened in human history. So I went out, I took it on a bike ride for the first trip around the neighborhood, and a neighborhood kid punched me out and took the bike. True story. And I was devastated. I went home to my dad and I said, Dad, so-and-so, this was 1984, so everyone knew everyone's last name and where they lived. So it was not exactly a well thought out crime. But anyway, my dad took me to, walked over to this other kid's house, knocked on the door. And what I'll do often when I tell this story, I'll say, what do you think happened when the kid's parents and they came to the door? Do you think my dad said, just say you're sorry and we'll be on our way and it'll all be fine? Or do you think my dad said, first, give the bike back, then say you're sorry, then we'll be on our way home? And of course, I use this story often because I give talks to kids, and even kids immediately know that there's really only one thing my dad could have possibly said on that porch, which was give the bike back and then say you're sorry, and then we move on. So that's land back, is that in the end, I don't think if we want justice out of this whole situation, I don't think there's any end to the story where Canada gets to keep the bike. And that's land back. And it's what I often refer to as, it's the and in the phrase truth and reconciliation. Because after truth come what old folks like I would say, I won't include Cary, but folks of my generation would say, we used to call these reparations. And now the kids just call this land back. And that's what we mean. And in terms of what this could look like, well, one of the first things that always springs to my mind is, and we're talking about this on, in honor of Orange Shirt Day and the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, is, well, one of the ways that Canada took the bike was through residential schools. And so one of the ways Canada could give the bike back was to build different types of schools to give back everything that was taken in the first part of schools. And that would be language, culture, all of it. We used to call these things in Canada like capital investment programs, when we build roads and hospitals and these sorts of things. That's what it was described when we built the schools in the first place, right? Back in the 1800s. We could do it in the 2000s, but of course they'd be run by entirely different people and for an entirely different purpose and governed by us for our communities to do that. But that's an example, I think, a very baseline and easy to understand, I hope, example of what it could look like. I don't think it means that literally anyone has to move. Okay. I think what it might mean is that the relationship in terms of how we share the land might need some alteration. And that in the end, if we want to get to the end, and this is where it gets uncomfortable for all the politicians that hear this story, it probably does require a new constitutional process in Canada, because when Canada was originally founded, the only nations that actually have the authority to grant Canada's sovereignty weren't invited. Because the only nations that can grant Canada its sovereignty are First Nations. I don't know why that is so hard to understand, but that's how it exists. So we would have to ultimately engage in that. But I think that is generations down the road. I think we got lots of time in between. I think, for example, a goal of my grandkids being fluent in my language, that would be a great goal for Canada to consider. And I think that's an incredibly achievable goal for Canada to consider. And it just takes an investment. And by the way, Canada invested untold billions into taking these things from us. They can invest a little bit in giving them back. And there was the end of my story for land back. I hope I didn't take too much time.
I love it. And Cary, I'm sure you have a response, but can I prompt you on another question? Because I'm really interested in the answer.
Okay.
Will you allow me? I'm sorry, we only have a few minutes left. This should have been like a 3-day conversation, I think. So someone put in the chat or the question and answer, does the form of documenting history, oral versus written, influence what information has been shared throughout generations? Or is this also a myth bias that Indigenous peoples did not record as much in writing? I think it's a brilliant question and I want to know the answer.
Yeah, and I'm going to answer it a couple of different ways. Part of it depends on at what moment in Canadian history you're talking about. Because now, for example, oral tradition is allowed in our court proceedings where it wasn't, through most of Canadian history. So, but we used many systems to record our histories. We used wampum belts, which are belts woven from white and purple shells, beads of shells that would encode what was agreed to, and individuals would carry those belts, would be entrusted with the memory and the memorization of the agreement that went with that belt. And whenever those communities came together again, those belts would be read first, a review of what we've agreed to previously before new negotiations would take place. We also had symbols that we would write on birch bark for communication, both ceremonially, but also just, Cousin Bob got a hole in his canoe. He had to stop and patch it up. And so the rest of us kept going and the river made a V. So we just put in a little, on a stick, a piece of birch bark that basically shows our clans and our family, and leans it over this way to show that we're going that way down the river. So there's all kinds of little ways that we communicated. We drew maps all the time. It's described in the historical record, but we drew them according to landmarks and prominent features, both in our oral tradition, but also what you could actually see on the landscape, rather than according to the sort of very particular attention to miles and half miles and all of that you would see on an accurate map, quote unquote, today. So we had a lot of ways of communication. Now, that said, the historical body of what's been collected, there's a lot of opportunities to read the record for what it doesn't think it's telling you. And I think I shared this example with you before. For one of my books, I read a lot of diaries of missionaries who were not exactly kind in their description of Indigenous people. So one particularly devoted diarist who had entries pretty much every day for the several years he lived in a community. The first time he saw the ceremony of the Medewan practiced, he complained in particular about the point right before initiation where they sing, or there's songs that are sung almost all night. And it kept him up. He didn't like the musicality. He complained about it incessantly. So meanwhile, he's sending all his reports back about all of his Christian converts. But through his diary, every single time the all-night sing happened as a part of that ceremony, he complained about it. So we could create a demonstration of the continued ceremonial activity in that community and write about that history. Him telling us, giving us the data he didn't want to be giving us, and certainly wasn't telling his bosses back home, but was very plain when you understood what his biases were and read the record in that light.
I love that example, Cary, in part because we live in an era where I think more and more people are learning to be skeptical of written word, right? So just because it's on the internet doesn't make it real. But yet we don't apply that same knowledge to a written record, that somehow we think that the people who were writing back then we're more honest or less biased than the people today, right? And so it's like, if we know to be critical about information we receive online, I mean, this is 100% accurate, but right, like, let's take that lesson and go on further. We're so close to out of time, but I do want to get to questions. There's a whole range about like, what do we do? How do we have these conversations? What can I do? So like 30 seconds to a minute or two to each of you. How do people pick this up now? How do they have these conversations with coworkers? How do they deal with white fragility in, especially if they're, a white person or a settler who can sort of engage and push? Thoughts, ideas? I'll go Jessie, and then I'll wrap it up with Cary, and then I'll say my closing thank yous.
Yeah, sure. I mean, certainly continue your own learning journey. I think it all sorts of emanates from here. Bring that to your home, your community, your workplace, and it sort of goes beyond there. As you can see from the way I've approached this conversation, I think humor, I know these are really difficult and dark subjects. Goodness knows, I understand that. Our people have approached much of this with humor as a way to cope and deal with it. So like if someone's having a moment of fragility around learning something true that they somehow take upon themselves, I would just, yeah, that sucks. Or, like because it does. And you can just sort of make a joke of it, but also acknowledge like none of us are saying anyone today did these things. We're just saying when you learn this new information, it would be great if we could do things maybe differently with this sort of a new understanding. And yeah, that's what I would really say. And the only other thing I would say is, we're coming up to like a family gathering season when everyone is actually going to be with each other. I think so often where people hear this, and I say this as someone who has a non-Indigenous side of the family, so I have some experience with this. Like it's when everyone's sort of loaded up on food and like is lazing back, and that's when nonsense starts coming out of people's mouths. Practice on your family, right? Because like there's workplace, other people out in the world, maybe you have other relationships and you don't want to damage them. Cousin Jim is being a dork at dinner. You can just tell Cousin Jim, like, you should be more comfortable with those sorts of things. And I would intervene. I do so around, particularly when I find myself in men-only environments where men sometimes say really horrific things around women. I feel it's my duty to go, not cool, let's stop that. And I think that those sorts of little things can actually go, and all you're saying is just don't say it around me, right? And if we all said it, well, suddenly you can't say it around anyone, and we're moving on to a better sort of place. Not to say we want to censor people. It's just like it's okay to have some thoughts and keep them to yourself, and learn and listen, and maybe your thought will change over time. But that humor, I think, is often really good, and Indigenous people, we laugh at this stuff. We don't want necessarily everyone else laughing at it, but it's okay to laugh like when we're laughing. And we, as we've approached this just this past week, Cary, Brenda, and everyone on this call, we've shared some laughs on these calls, and I think that's part of how we do this.
Amazing. Cary.
So you brought up fragility, and fragility is usually a reaction that is defensive. So whether it is saying, oh, I'm so sorry, and turning all the discussion to how sorry you are, or whether it's saying, but this is the way we've always done things, and so it's okay to do it that way. Both of those are ways of essentially getting away from the actual impact on someone. So whether someone says what you said hurt me, or what this policy at our workplace is doing is causing me a barrier, you need to make sure that you're talking about the actual impact and not about intentions. Because if you're focusing on intentions, you're not doing the work. And I think that's a really fundamental thing, because it applies to so many places in which you have these conversations. But certainly I think learning the broader history supporting efforts to provide that broader history in your kids' schools, supporting efforts to bring languages into your kids' schools, and encouraging your province to support funding for those things. All of these are really important things that any person can do. But also, you know, take the time to read the 94 calls to action, all 94, and think about, how does this apply to the work that I do? Read UNDRIP. Two of the calls to action say we need to bring in the ethical framework of UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Think about how the articles of UNDRIP impact the work that you do, and the choices that you make. And I think those are really good reflection pieces, certainly to start with, as well as the calls to justice from the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. I just, I feel so enriched, and we've learned, I think, so much. And you know, we all know we were here less than an hour. It's the tip of the iceberg. So lots of calls for resources and information. So first I want to say, like, a huge miigwech, a great big thank you for joining us. This will be placed on the NCTR YouTube. So people can, if you want to share it, like, wow, everyone I know needs to, you know, learn this, feel free to share that around. You all want to keep the conversation going because we didn't have a ton of engagement with, you know, 3,000 people. So here are some questions, and we'll put this all up on the NCTR website under the TNR Week page. You know, start asking these questions, start having these conversations. Keep learning, you know, where can we learn more about, you know, some of this history and the history before Canada? Right, we've got resources up there. We've got some films, a lot of great stuff there. We also have, we've partnered with Meta at the NCTR to create an interactive learning experience through Messenger. So there's a QR code there. You can hop on there and learn about residential schools and some of the history there. And so last, I just want to say, keep joining us to learn. The conversation will continue all week. And so we hope that you all keep coming back. Again, a huge thank you to our guests for joining us and bringing an amazing conversation starter. And I really hope for everyone, it's a conversation starter, and we keep moving this forward. So thank you so much, and have a wonderful day, everyone.